Welcome to the Lightbulb Moment podcast. You are listening to episode 37, Essential Advice for Delivering Virtually. In this episode, platform and hardware choices, the importance of engagement, facilitation basics, design planning, starting a session right, setting expectations for your attendees, and Joe and Mike's tips and stories. A quick message from Mike here before we get into the actual podcast, just to say this is by far the longest podcast we've ever done. We just wanted to cram so much into this one, and Joe and I thought it was going to be a good idea, and I will put the details in the description for the podcast as well, just to let you know the sort of the title parts where you could skip to if parts aren't relevant to you. So if you just want to hear about platform, you can go straight into 4 minutes into this. If you want to hear about hardware, that is 10 minutes in. If you want to hear about engagement and facilitation, that is 20 minutes in. For the design section, that is 40 minutes in. For starting a sessions, that's 59 minutes. And for all of our stories about what we've done wrong and for the bits of advice that we forgot in those other sections, that is 70 minutes into the podcast. I hope you enjoy, everyone. Welcome everyone to episode 37 of our podcast, recorded at the beginning of April, and hopefully sort of with the world events is going to be getting better soon, we hope, Joe.
Yeah, we hope we're at the height of the coronavirus with better news to come in coming weeks. We're in kind of strange circumstances. There are lockdowns where we are in the UK and for many countries around the world right now. Yeah,
definitely sort of strange situation that everyone is in, sort of bizarre being sort of locked in at home. But because of this, because everyone is having to sort of go to remote learning, remote working, we have been sort of inundated with people asking us for advice, asking us for tips. How do they just do that first step of, how do I get my session online, or, how do I just train my team? And that's why we thought, let's just bring all of this together in an epic sort of where to start podcast.
Yeah, so many people right now have had their traditional way of learning or teaching or facilitating completely change, in some cases literally overnight, into a digital format. And going to live online learning or virtual classroom delivery, it can be scary at the best of times, let alone when you need to do so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've said, we're going to try and do this as a longer podcast. We're going to try and sort of hit an overview of all of these sort of essential points that you might be aware of, you might not be aware of, and try and provide some sort of like tips and advice just to make it a smoother transition, as you say, for those people where it's literally yesterday you were in a face-to-face session, tomorrow you've got to do something different online.
Yeah, and I've been doing this for over 7 years now, and I want to be able to provide the knowledge I've gained over that time, tell you what not to do, so maybe you can learn from my mistakes too and not have to make those.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so in which case, so we're going to go through this episode. If you are the one or two people who've actually listened to all of our episodes, this one is going to be much more of an overview. So we're going to be touching upon lots of our previous podcast episodes, but we're just going to do those essential bits. And I'm also going to drop, and it's probably going to get annoying, but I'm going to, when we talk about a topic or a subject, I'm also going to say what podcast episodes we've done, which go into a lot more depth, because we're just giving those sort of highlights here as a sort of a one-stop shop of listen to this one. Hopefully you've got some great ideas to actually start delivering.
Mike, you are never annoying.
And on that note, let's just jump straight into it. So the first thing that most people often ask us is platform. What platform do they choose? And hardware, what do they actually need to start doing this? So do you want to hit us with this, Joe?
Of course. So, as Mike said, we've got episode 9, which is all about platform choices, and episode 12 is about hardware. But let's focus on some of those core elements about the essence and the speed that we're working at in these times, rather than in those episodes, we took a much more broad view of things.
Yeah, exactly. This is definitely let's just get straight to the point. Platform, let's go then.
I always say the best platform is the one you have. If you've got access to one already, use it and work with it. Also, of course, many people right now need to get a platform. That's a new thing. The platform that most people are jumping to, of course, is Zoom. Yeah. That's Zoom meetings. Zoom Webinar, it's a different thing. It's a crucial difference. Zoom Meetings is geared much more towards collaborative groups. Zoom Webinar is much more broadcast. It's to large groups of, hundreds of people. And the reason people are flocking to Zoom Meetings is, quite frankly, it's cheap. Licenses start at just shy of maybe £12 or $15 a month, and it's super easy to use.
Okay, and so for that £12 or $15 a month, what does that actually give you?
You get a platform where up to 100 attendees can come into each session. It's simple to use and get started. And it's got some great virtual classroom or collaboration tools. It's got whiteboards. It's got those emoticons, green tick and things like that. It's got the chat functionality. You've got breakout rooms and you've got polls.
Perfect. So you've kind of got a core group of virtual classroom tools, the raise hand, the green tick, you've got the chat window, so that you can really start running some basic activities and even some more interesting activities also.
Absolutely. So you can design really engaging sessions for Zoom using all those tools that they've got.
And if you can, just in a quick nutshell, because some people might get confused. So Zoom Meetings is more for you want to do virtual classrooms, you want to use those whiteboards, things like that. Zoom Webinar loses some of those that functionality.
Yeah, Zoom Meetings is basically anything like a one-to-one, a chat with your mum, a team meeting, right through to up to 100 people for some kind of learning event. I mean, that technically could be a webinar, of course, but it's got all of the functions you need for interaction and collaboration. Zoom Webinar has got less, so there's no annotation tools for attendees, but you do have a question and answer pod, for instance, so you can't unmute people in webinar format. So it's a different tool for a different job. Zoom Meetings, the term is a little bit weird because you might think, well, I don't want a meeting, but it's just Zoom Meetings for anything that you're running, if it's not a great big webinar.
Okay, absolutely great. And what about the other options that people might be looking into right now?
So if you pay a bit more money, you can get access to Adobe Connect, for instance. I think the 25-person license is about £40 a month, and that gives you all of the things like whiteboards, breakouts and stuff that we discussed before. There's also WebEx Training Center, and there's other WebEx kind of options as well. There's the go-to products. There's loads of different things. In a nutshell, they all do similar things, but they've got different bells and whistles, and that's what you need to check really. Does WebEx Meetings give you the same options as WebEx Training Center? No, it doesn't. So you just need to check, do I want breakouts? Do I want polls? Do I want, annotation tools? Whatever it might be. And Zoom is really good because it's cheap. Adobe Connect and WebEx and things are more expensive, but they are designed as virtual classroom tools. So they're a little bit different and they do have those bells and whistles.
Okay, great. I understand. And so what about Skype for Business, Microsoft Office Teams? This is something that on our community, we've had quite a few posts about.
So I haven't used those platforms as much for virtual classrooms, so I don't have so much in-depth knowledge. On our free webinar, we've had questions about it as well, and we've been looking at these, and from the knowledge I have, you can absolutely use them. And like I say, if you've got them, use them. But they aren't designed for virtual classrooms and for the type of learning and collaboration that we might like to do in a face-to-face session. So, for instance, they don't have breakout rooms natively, and you have to do a bit more of a workaround in order to be able to do that. And they can be a little bit more complicated than something like Zoom, which is literally switch it on and go.
Yeah, and so what about any final points on platforms before we move on to the hardware part of this section?
I think if you're looking at different options right now, make sure that the platform has chat. I often have people saying to me that they've got issues running virtual classrooms. For instance, in GoToWebinar, there was a Twitter conversation about it the other day, and I was just like, no. Like Zoom Webinar, it's geared towards broadcast and not interaction. So, for example, GoToWebinar does not have a chat window. It's got a Q&A panel, but you lose all of that interaction and social learning. So it's a tool for a job that is not virtual classrooms. Okay, yeah. So I guess it's one of those things when you're thinking about the session you want to deliver, you need to make sure that whatever platform you're looking at, whether it's in your price range, is to make sure that it's got
those interaction points. Can you get engagement? Can you use the chat window? Has it got emoticons? Can you do a whiteboard? And if it's got those functions and it's within your price range, then that's the place to start, basically.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for that, Joe. And as you mentioned earlier, you can listen to episode 9 if you want to know more about platforms. We jump into a lot more detail about the different options. But as we've said, that's a longer episode. This one is more just getting straight to the points. And on that, what about hardware?
Okay, at an absolute minimum level, you need a computer and a way that you can hear and a microphone so that people can hear you. If you've got a laptop, the microphone and speakers should be there automatically. If you have a desktop computer, you might not have those inbuilt. Hopefully you have them already. With these items, you can deliver your virtual classroom session.
And what about running a session from your phone or a tablet device?
Well, you can do it. And it's certainly better than nothing. It's also great as a backup. But even in these circumstances we're in at the moment, I'd still recommend you don't try and deliver a full-on webinar or virtual classroom session only from your phone or tablet.
Yeah, because we often get asked this sort of like, can I just use my iPad or my Android device to deliver a whole session? So you're basically saying, try not to.
Yeah, if it's the only thing you've got and a backup, great. But no, because it's just not going to be good enough for you, for the attendees, and the technology is great, but it's just not going to be as good as we'd like it to be, even in the situation and context we're in now.
And what about even if you've just got a laptop, whether it's one you've been given from work, or whether it's brand new, or maybe it's a few years old, whatever? Is that realistic to be able to deliver a live online session with?
Well, yeah, because I think that's the realistic situation a lot of people are in, quite frankly, at the moment. And the hardware you have might be what you're stuck with. Yeah,
okay, so it's kind of like, technically you can use a phone or a tablet, but a much better option is going to be your laptop with, whether it's got inbuilt speakers and microphone, or an actual sort of desktop computer.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, if you want to be using a laptop or desktop computer, that's really good. And for these reasons, one is stability. You've got much less worry about things like the screen switching off and battery running out if you're on a desktop computer, for instance. And of course, keep it plugged in. I can't tell you the number of times people have gone halfway through a session, oh, I'll be right back, I need to plug the laptop in. And I just end up smacking my head and go, why would you not have it plugged in?
Yeah.
And if you're using a computer, you hopefully have the option of having an internet connection, a wired Ethernet cable rather than Wi-Fi. And that's a much stronger, much more stable internet connection. The other thing is, with a laptop or desktop, you're going to have some kind of larger screen, especially more than a phone or a tablet device. And it means managing the session, managing the attendees, presenting whatever documents, probably PowerPoint. It's going to be much easier. And also you might have your session notes or facilitator guide all there with you. It's just so much easier.
Yeah, for sure. Some really great points there, Joe. And especially with, bandwidth is in high demand at the moment. And connection issues are occurring quite often in sessions. We've been running a lot more sessions recently. We've had people disconnecting, or they can't hear the sound and things like that. And being on Wi-Fi, it's just not going to help with this, especially when you're the facilitator. It's going to be a nightmare for your attendees if they can't properly listen to your delivery, if you're cutting out every other word. And this is why we always recommend using a cable directly to your computer instead of Wi-Fi if you can.
Yeah, and this leads me on to my next point about microphones. Just like you said about missing every kind of other word the facilitator says because of connection issues, the same can happen from a bad microphone. One of the most essential things is that attendees can hear you and hear you well. You can, of course, use the microphone built into your laptop or computer, but it might not be the best quality, and that could impact on the outcome of your session. Even one of the cheapest headsets with a microphone will improve the quality. The better microphone you can get, if possible, of course, will help even more. And a headset can also stop audio feedback loops. And we've sometimes had that with attendees on our sessions too.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you don't know what the audio feedback loop is, that is basically if you're using speakers, so your sound is sort of being output into the room. And if you've then got a microphone, the sound that comes out of your speakers goes into your microphone. And then that is then transmitted back into the platform and comes out of your speakers. So the same sound keeps cycling and cycling, and it gets distorted and distorted every time it does this. And it can really go from just a little bit of annoyance to completely just crippling the audio in your session. You get this really loud, high-pitched squeak, and it's awful.
Yeah, absolutely deafening. And there are ways around it. So if you don't have a headset and you are running this way, and that's a potential problem that you're running into, you need to make sure only one person is unmuted and talking at a time. So try and use a system where attendees need basically to ask permission to unmute. So it's basically just click the hand up icon and you say, hey Bob, unmute, and then you mute, and then you avoid all of that feedback back loop that you talk about there. It can feel a bit contrived, it can feel a bit awkward at first, but people soon get used to it, and they soon get used to that hand up icon. And actually it makes everything run so much more smoothly. And this way you can make sure that you mute, an attendee mutes before the next person speaks. And you can still deliver with this basic hardware, such as your laptop speakers and microphone. You just need to manage it a bit more to ensure that good quality.
Yeah, for sure. And in a sort of face-to-face session, people quickly get used to you raise your hand and the facilitator looks at you and says, okay, what's your question? You know, it's the same online, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so going back to that microphone quality, because this is probably one of our, other than platform, microphone is the question we get asked all the time. Now, we both have microphones which are a pretty good quality. Because we record things like podcasts, we run virtual classrooms all the time. So we've invested in that. But as you've said, if you're new to this, you might be stuck with sort of the whatever is the best thing you've got available, even if it's sort of like a basic cheap headset. Is that going to be better than your laptop?
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that if your laptop microphone isn't that great, what you might find is if you move around, if you're in a different place from your laptop, it can be hard to hear. And the last thing you want to do is to be stooping down to wherever your microphone is in your laptop so that people can hear you. So it just makes things much more easy and relaxed if you've got a headset.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, if you're looking into investing into a headset or microphone, make sure if it's a headset with the microphone attached to it, you really check those reviews, because often the review will say, oh, the sound quality, so what you hear is amazing. You listen to your music, it's great. But often in the same review, the microphone quality, they will say it's terrible. So you need to try and make sure you check those reviews that it's got both. And if anything, it's probably going to be more important to have the microphone quality.
Yeah, and I think actually if you're searching for a business headset rather than say a gaming headset, will maybe just make that difference.
Yeah, potentially. But Joe, you and I both use a standalone USB microphone. So what this is, it's not a microphone which is attached to our headset. It's its own standard device, and it's USB, so it just plugs straight into a USB slot, and it just makes life a little bit easier to use, doesn't it?
Yeah, the USB headsets are really easy to use, plug in and go. And again, all of this is nice to have. It's not essential. Go with what's best for you. We do this all day, every day. We record videos and podcasts, so we've got this different equipment. Yeah,
exactly. And if you want to hear more about this, episode 12, you can hear all the details about hardware. We talk about different monitors we use and how we've got our monitor set up and the microphones and all of these different things. So if you want to hear much more about this topic, episode 12 is definitely the one you want to listen to. So if I just can summarize this section that we've gone through here, Joe. So it's basically, you can start with basic hardware, but you have to be aware of potential limitations and workarounds such as raise hand to unmute, making sure you don't get that audio feedback loop. If you can use a laptop or a desktop PC with a wired internet connection, not Wi-Fi, try and do that if possible. If you do have to use Wi-Fi, try turning off as many of the other devices as possible that would be using up that Wi-Fi sort of bandwidth. A larger screen or multiple screens is a nice thing to have. It's going to make it easier to see what you're presenting, to have your materials up, but you can make do with what you have. And if you, again, like with what we've just said there, if you can invest in a better microphone, the audio quality will be better, which is really important for virtual classrooms, but you might just need to manage it if you can't do that.
Great summary, Mike. We didn't cover anything about having a second computer logged in to give the viewpoint as an attendee and as a backup if your main computer stops working. And that could be a tablet or a phone device as well. And there's more information in episode 12, as Mike said.
Yeah, perfect, Joe. So that's saying, if your main computer or your main laptop crashes or goes down, if you've got a second device, even if it's just a phone, you could jump onto that and say, hi guys, I'm still here. Give me a second. But yeah, that's in episode 12. Okay, so let's jump straight into the next point then, the importance of engagement and what that means for your facilitation.
I could speak for hours about engagement, but I will try and keep it short. Engagement is important for various reasons, and one of the first ones is attendee attention span. I'm sure you've been on those boring webinars where the facilitator just speaks at you. They don't ask any questions. You can't respond in chat. You're never asked to. You get bored and you've not been engaged in the session.
Yeah, and exactly. And I guess in the world we live in at the moment, so many devices and apps trying to get our attention, as well as people in our offices or emails or right now in our homes, the dog, the cat jumping on you. There's a lot to contend with.
Yeah, and we need to make sure that our attendee is engaged to keep their focus on the facilitation and the learning rather than their emails or the phone or the cat or the kids. Unless the kids need you, obviously. And the second point is actually about learning points. If we don't engage people, how will we get them to understand a learning point? How will we as facilitators have any idea if they've got something or not?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And what is it you always love to say? If you could learn perfectly just by being told something, then teaching would be easy. I'm not sure if I've butchered that line. I normally do.
You probably have. It's close enough, Mike, yeah. You can't just tell people and they learn. If that worked, we'd have classrooms of hundreds or thousands of students and they'd all learn. We'd never have an argument with our other half. And it's just not the case. We need smaller classrooms, less attendees, more activities and discussions to engage people in, to get people learn through doing, learning from each other, learning from experience. And as a facilitator, I need the feedback that they've understood something or they need more on a topic, for instance.
Yeah, and this is, you mentioned quite often, and definitely like in episode 20, which was sort of dedicated to digital body language. Is this what we're talking about here? Is this points of digital body language?
Yeah, absolutely. And how I look at digital body language is from the viewpoint of using it in a live online learning setting. It's all about how the attendees are using the technology and interacting, and how we can build up a picture of them just like you would face to face. So you might have a certain attendee that never uses the microphone, but uses chat a lot. Another attendee is always the last to use the green tick or red X emoticon. And I can start building up a picture. Is it that they don't understand the questions? Do I need to clarify something more? It's so many different ways to interpret things.
And I guess this is just like in the classroom where you keep seeing a frown on someone's face and you start building up your own physical body language picture mentally of, did they frown at the last sort of learning point? Does that mean they didn't understand the last learning point and that's why they're not understanding this point? It's all really interesting, thinking about this and utilising it with digital body language. And will that help your facilitation?
Absolutely it will, but if we look at the point of view of somebody who's just starting this, they might be listening to this and going, digital what now?
Yep.
And just like, this is way too much. So I think this is something to say, like, have it in your mind. It exists. We've got that podcast about it. Go and listen. We've got blogs on it and whatnot. But don't worry about it. Just make sure you're aware of it. Just make sure it's a case of, right, okay, I know that I can't see people at the moment and I'm losing that physical body language. And I know that Joe and Mike talk about the fact that once I get comfortable, I'm going to start seeing it. The main point here is just engage with your attendees to get feedback. And once you start doing that, you'll start seeing this digital body language through the fog of this new way that you're working in.
Yeah, really, really good points. And I guess bringing this back to the engagement, maybe more of the basics. How do we keep attendees engaged in the session, especially if we're new to facilitation and have either never done it before or we've only done a few sessions?
Really good question. And actually in our live Q&A that actually we just did this morning, we've got loads of people in that situation that are terrified and at the point of going, actually, I'm not going to do any engagement because I just don't think I can manage it. So a lot of this is in the design of the session. And we'll get to that, I think, later in the podcast we'll chat. For right now, we need to make sure that as a facilitator, we're comfortable with the tools that we're asking our attendees to get involved with. There's no point going and doing breakout rooms if, quite frankly, you don't feel comfortable with the technology or the activity.
Yeah, and I guess sort of bringing this back to the face-to-face examples, it's exactly the same as if you didn't have faith that the projector was going to work or that, the room down the hall was going to be unlocked for your, breakout room, you wouldn't use it, would you? You would come up with a workaround.
Exactly. So if you're completely new to virtual classrooms, stick to chat. Maybe emoticons, maybe after a few sessions introduce some polls. This way you can control the engagement and you still have it in there, but you're hopefully not overwhelming yourself too much. You're not giving yourself too much to do. You need to make sure, as you are the facilitator, you're as comfortable as possible. Otherwise, quite frankly, that unease, it will come across to your attendees. It will affect you and your confidence. It will affect everything. Some of the simple things to consider doing live online when you're new to this. Part of the training delivery is, it's just that, it's delivery of some content. Try and make sure to deliver just one point for a minute or two, and then do something to get some feedback from people. Just like you might be observing their physical body language, you look around the room and go, they're not getting it. Or, they're all nodding and smiling, I'll move on. It could be as simple as asking for a green tick or check mark to say, if you're happy with the explanation so far, green tick. Or red X if there's something I've said to confuse you. Now, notice that language. Is there something I've said to confuse you? Rather than you don't understand it, it makes it kind of less threatening. It's a different way to ask that question.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it can all of a sudden be like, do you understand this green tick? And you don't want to be the person to red X, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's just like, okay, just put the onus on me. Maybe I've mucked something up. Just let me know and I'll explain it again. And something even better than that, of course, would be to ask everyone a question, get them to respond in the chat window, and their answers will tell you if they understand your learning point. This is the feedback that can help you either move on and go, great, everybody's got it, or have a conversation to ensure your learning point has really got across. It means we're knowing where people are at in the session, and it's not 20 minutes in before we realise that there are huge problems.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And some of the things we hear, though, is that people say, how can they make it so these interactions are not contrived? It's like, I've just delivered a piece of theory, and then you say, right, everyone, green tick now, and it can feel really forced.
Yeah, it can almost feel like robotic, or like we're doing literally a tick box exercise. It's like, Joe has told us to interact, we've interacted, move on.
Yeah, I guess you could kind of think in the face-to-face classroom, it's like, I've just shown you this on the whiteboard, everyone nod now. Do you, it's that kind of equivalent, isn't it?
Yeah, we definitely wouldn't be kind of saying everybody nod right now. So it does feel a little bit weird. And being honest, it can sometimes feel that way, especially if you're new to virtual facilitation. I still think they will be better than not having them at all. As you do it more, it will become more natural. As the attendees do it more, it will become more natural to them. Anything you do for the first time will feel effortful and strange. So when you learn to drive a car, you had to force yourself to say mirror, signal, maneuver. every time you wanted to change lanes or take a turning. Now you probably do it in one sweeping movement and it's just on autopilot.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm always surprised when in our training session, whether it's a course or a one-off session, and you say something and you've not even asked for green ticks or crosses, and yet many of the attendees start putting a green tick up. And it's almost as if they're, you've just said something and they go, oh, yeah, definitely, I agree with this. Or somebody then puts a red cross and you say, oh, okay, Jane, Bob, why did you put a red cross? And that hasn't been a planned, interaction. They've just done it.
Exactly, Mike. And by starting with interactions, even if they're a bit contrived, you start building towards having moments like this with your attendees, and it all starts to become so much more natural.
Okay. So what about some quick ideas on how to manage interactions in the sessions? We know we need interactions, but just some of those basic level tips on where to start with this.
Okay, I will say some, but I'm very wary that I'm going to be repeating a lot of what I've said in previous podcasts. Episode 5, episode 14, and more recently episode 29, which was all about facilitating your first session.
Okay.
So I'll hit you some core points, and you guys know where to go if you want more details. So, firstly, try and direct attendees and tell them what you want them to do, such as, in the chat window, type your answer to blah, blah, blah. Or click the hand up icon and I'll invite you to unmute about blah, blah, blah topic. Or use the green tick if you've had an experience of blah, blah, blah. And this is important because it lets the attendee know what's expected of them, but it also allows you as the facilitator to just focus on one area of the screen. Yeah,
I think this is a really important point. And if there's one thing, I don't know what the rest of the podcast is, but if there's one thing to take away from this podcast, it is this point of directing attendees, because it makes your life as a facilitator so much easier. And I've seen it in sessions, from other virtual classrooms, or when we've had people practicing in our sessions, or even, unfortunately, there are points where I actually sort of facilitate parts of our own courses, and I've done exactly the same. But it's really important to have in your mind, you need to direct them where to go, because one of the easiest ways to get lost in facilitation and to get overwhelmed live online is not by saying use the chat window or use the whiteboard or use a green tick. If all of a sudden you ask a question, say, just let me know. And all of a sudden you've got people typing on a whiteboard, you've got people typing in the chat window, somebody's raised a hand, and as the facilitator you're jumping around, and then you've got lost of what have you read on the whiteboard. You don't know, you need to scroll up on the chat window.
It can feel like the session's slipping away from you. It can feel like you've lost control. And this is what disengages people from you, the learning and this modality, because you've missed their hand up and they go, oh, well, what's the point in putting my hand up? They're not going to let me speak on a microphone. Or I type something in chat and they've ignored it. So try and use the same terminology each time and make sure you direct your attendees, and it will save you a lot of pain in the long run. For example, even in the notes we've made ahead of today's session, Mike, you wrote, put your hand up or raise hand. And actually I changed it to what I always say, which is click the hand up icon. It's a little bit clearer. It's a little bit more precise.
Yeah, that's a great point. And especially, our attendees might be new to this, using that same terminology, like you say, like click the hand up icon and I will invite you to unmute. If you say that over and over and over, eventually by halfway through the session, the second session, the fifth session, they just know it. They understand it straight away.
Yeah, by session 5, you're saying, hand up, what do you think?
Yeah.
And people just know. But certainly at the beginning, keep that kind of same phrase. Another good tip is to slow down. Now, this is good advice for face-to-face training, for speaking to large groups and so on. We often want to speed up. Perhaps the adrenaline's kicking in, or we feel the need to speak really quickly and get our point across because there's not much time. But it's in these points we need to slow down. And Mike, you are actually, especially at the moment in the current situation where we've been doing lots of training and trying to get lots of content across to people, you've sometimes in private messaging me in sessions and saying, breathe, slow down.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that it's really hard to do. And from my viewpoint as a producer, it's easy to say that. It's easy for me to look at the situation from outside and just, sit there and go, Joe, you were just talking a million miles an hour. You need to slow down. But when you've got the pressure of the session, it's just really easy to slip into that speaking quickly. And I have it even as a producer. In the Q&A session we did this morning, you had a point where the chat was really busy and you said, Mike, give me an update. And I wasn't expecting it. And all of a sudden I was like, well, in the chat, we've got this. And, all of a sudden it's like I'm an auctioneer, over here, because it's a natural thing. But the problem is, like we said about the microphone quality, you need to make sure the attendees can hear you and hear you really well. And that can make a huge difference to the outcome of your session.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was an interesting conversation after our first Q&A on LinkedIn where somebody had said, Joe, you've got great passion and stuff like that. And I said, oh, sorry, I was talking a bit fast. And they said, no, the speed that you were talking about was your passion coming across, but also I wasn't particularly interested in the topic, but you kept me engaged. So there's a fine line. You must use your voice really well, but not speaking 10 to the dozen. And also we need to consider that perhaps the language you're facilitating in might not be the first or even second language of your attendees. So the sound quality of your microphone might not be the best. Everyone's using the internet at the moment and there's lots of people having bandwidth issues. So speaking slowly and clearly will help with all of these scenarios. And there's another reason we might wanting to be speaking quickly as well. And that's because there's silence on the line and new facilitators get really worried about that.
Absolutely, yes. This is one of the things that we actually try and sort of in our courses get through to the facilitators we're training. You can ask a question and you can pause, you can breathe, you can relax for a second and allow people to think. You don't need to fill every single moment with talking, especially if it's rambling. you don't.
We never do that, Mike, never, ever.
Yeah, exactly. But I think another point here is maybe just being honest and taking ownership, especially if you are new to this, sort of explaining whether it's in an email before the session or at the start of the session and say, right, guys, I'm new to this. We're all new to this. The circumstances have brought us to this situation. I'm going to try and use chat as much as possible, but I really want to focus on my delivery and what I'm doing here today. I will try and come back to the chat if I can. That's a valid thing you can do, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think under normal non-COVID-19 situations, I would never say, hi, I'm new, please put up with me doing a bad job, because hopefully you should have had the time to prepare and learn and do everything really well. But that's not the situation we're in. And right now, it's absolutely fine to say, look, we're all in this together. Let's help each other out. Let's be forgiving. We still need to be professional. We still need to do as much prep and planning as we can under the circumstances. So, it's about a case of like, if you've got a question, put your hand up and I'll come to it when I see it. You can lay down kind of ground rules or ways of working. And just keep it easy for yourself. It's much better to tell people, for instance, that you won't be able to keep up with chat at all. And if you've got a question, maybe write it in capitals or say hand up and unmute, like we've just said. Or we'll talk about this later in the podcast, maybe about setting expectations. You could have a producer, you could have an attendee who is responsible for collecting those questions, maybe. Yeah,
that's actually some really good ideas. And again, like I say, it's taking that ownership and potentially controlling what could be a bad situation of attendees thinking that the facilitator isn't answering any of my questions or whatever. At least then you've sat there and gone, right, okay, as attendee, I either know that this is the situation, or I have, like you say, some of those ground rules of if I type everything in caps, maybe that question will be answered.
Yeah.
And one thing I think and this is something that I always try and bring up as well, is that you can still use your facilitation style online. Often people go like robotic and they think that they have to completely change all of how they normally facilitate a session, but you can still do that online, can't you?
Absolutely. It's about pace, it's about energy, it's about what is right for you. If your sessions are thoughtful and deep and quiet and reflective, then make those your online sessions. My sessions tend to be a bit more pacey, hopefully a bit of a laugh at me, if nothing else, with some obviously some technical or deep or serious stuff in there. But that's my style and my personality, and yours is different. So go with your personality and how you want your session to run.
Absolutely. I can't agree with that anymore. So let me just do a quick summary then on this section. So it's basically keep it simple by using only a few tools that you're comfortable with. Remember to direct and tell attendees what you want them to do, with what tool, with what area of the platform. Try and speak clearly, slowly, just slow down and breathe if you can. And then be honest with your attendees if you are new, how you were going to use the software. Set those ground rules. Continue to use your facilitation style. Don't try and change it completely don't try and do a new online persona. Still use your facilitation style. And remember, we've got episodes 5, 14, 20, which all go into engagement and how to facilitate, and episode 29, which we did more recently, which is all about those facilitation tips as well. Let's move on to design for your first session.
Again, this is a huge topic to go over, but let's have a look at some highlights from previous episodes.
Yeah, exactly. So we had episode 10 and 11, which were purely dedicated for design. But let's talk through the necessities to know for getting to face-to-face sessions online quickly. So
the right mindset makes a huge difference here. You can achieve most, if not all, of what you do face-to-face in a live online session. And it could be even better live online. Also, you can't just deliver your face-to-face session verbatim. It needs to be designed specifically for live online delivery. This doesn't mean you need to throw out the whole thing. You might still be able to take large sections of content and just modify them for live online, especially if time is a crucial factor, as quite frankly it probably is for most people right now.
Yeah, often we hear people saying that the face-to-face sessions they run just simply will never work online. And this is, quite frankly, a defeatist attitude to start from a design point of view. If you're going into design thinking, well, it's just never going to work, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. And often people are really surprised how well a session does work online. And if they'd gone in with that open mindset, as you say, they might have got to that end result a bit quicker, or it might not have been so painful to get there. And with regards to designing for live online, just where do you start with this?
I think the first great thing that you should have already with your face-to-face sessions are the learning and the performance objectives. This is the core of any learning intervention, whether it's live, online or not. What does the attendee need to be able to do? And if you've got that, then you can build a virtual session around it, quite frankly.
And I guess you also already have sort of the technical knowledge or language and the theory. You've already got it written down in that face-to-face session also.
Yeah, so it's about identifying those learning objectives, looking at the activities you currently do face-to-face and translating or converting those into the live online tools, and looking at the delivery elements you go over and deciding if that needs to be maybe multiple slides to break down a complex theory point. Does it need an activity for discussion? And it's always starting with how do you get the attendees to learn it face-to-face, and then how can you achieve that live online?
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying you have a half day face-to-face training session. You identify that the main learning points are X, Y, Z, whatever they are. And in that face-to-face session, you would normally have people brainstorm ideas at this point or group discussion at another point. You start to build that into your live online session. You might have sections where you talk through some content. You need to decide how that translates into your slides in the live online environment. Do you need to break those slides down into multiple slides? Do you need to pause and have that green tick or red cross? Have you understood these points? Get those metaphorical nods of agreement or puzzled looks on faces.
At a basic level, that's pretty much it. You need to think about how long you want to run the session for. We tend to work with 2-hour sessions with a 5-minute break in the middle. That works for us, but others might find shorter or longer sessions work better for their organisation and their attendees. I would suggest not doing all-day virtual sessions. It could be a bit much for attendees and, quite frankly, facilitators. They can be done, but they require really good design, a lot of planning. And I think if you're doing this rapidly, if you have the choice not to, I'd try and split it up.
Yeah, agreed, Joe. I mean, starting off with shorter sessions is likely going to be a good place to start. Going back to designing the actual session, though, what other tips do people need to know? It can't be as simple as just replicate what you do face-to-face live online.
Yeah, I really wish it was that simple, Mike. And in reality, it's one of those things where you really do need to know a few of the tools in a platform really well before designing a session. You need to know what can you do in the chat and how it works. Does your platform allow for private messages between attendees? Because if it does, you could design activities where they work in pairs and private chat, just the same as turn to the person next to you. If you don't know the platform can do this or how to turn it on in the options, then you can't design that activity. It's the same with the whiteboard. You need to know what tools are available. Can you use the stamp tools? Can a user move their text? Do they have an arrow tool with their name on it? Once you know this, even if it's just a few tools, you can start to build activities and a mixture, a variety, not just the same one each time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's varying the use of the tool. Even if it's the same tool, it can be really important. Getting people to type in the chat and then type in the chat and then type in the chat, it can get repetitive, it can get boring. But if you get them to type a question in chat, and then maybe the next point is they private chat in pairs, and then you do a chat hold and send, it can just mix it up a bit. So even though you're using the same tool, you're keeping it a little bit fresh each time. And you can do the same with whiteboards. You do an open brainstorm, then use a swim lane, then use a stamp tool. It's that variation. Variation is the spice of life, isn't it?
Variety is the spice of life.
I never get these quotes. I never get these quotes right. I completely blame it on my mother. But anyway, carry on.
Okay, not a therapy session. So these things we go into more detail in episodes 10 and episodes 11. But it really is important to have that variety, Michael, in the use of your tool, even if it's the same tool that you're using. One thing I should also mention is you need to teach the tools and the communication methods in the session. We'll get to this shortly, but when designing a session, if you plan to have any type of activity, you need to teach that tool to the attendees. Yeah,
that is a really good point. And, we always need to teach the particular tool so that they know how to use it. Yeah. And often we do it as we start off with like a fun slide, a fun point. It's kind of like, okay, you guys have never used a whiteboard. Here's a whiteboard. Just put what you can see out your window, or a funny nickname that people call you, or whatever it is. And then it just gets them so that we can see that they found the annotation tools, that they've used it. And then we can sit there and go, right, let's go into the actual activity now. But you have to educate them on how to actually use the platform.
Yeah, it lets us know that they can use the tool, that they can understand it in relation to the activity that we then run. So you can then build on this. So later in your design, you have an activity where maybe you use the stamp tools instead of using the text tool where you've written on the screen. The attendee already understands the concept of the whiteboard. They already know they can annotate or click on the screen. And it's a slightly different tool, but it's familiar from what they did before.
Yeah, exactly. And with live online facilitation, virtual classrooms, there needs to be a bit of hand-holding from the facilitator. Normally, you don't need to explain, turn to the person next to you and discuss the question. But live online, you need that extra 30 seconds to say, click in a chat panel, find where it says private chat, find your, the person you want to type to, and then start typing. It's just an extra step.
Yeah. And when it comes to the design, you need to be building that knowledge base up from what you've taught attendees so far in the session and potentially kind of across your course in general. So I taught them the tool at the start of the session, so we just go in and use that now. Or I taught them in session 1, but actually we haven't used it then, and we're in session 3 now. So I'll just do a quick reminder. It requires a little bit more planning, but it gets quicker and people get used to it, especially throughout a session or a course. And I think another really important point here is just teach them the one tool they need to use, then use it immediately. We've seen so many people spend 10 minutes teaching you every tool at the beginning and then not using them until an hour later, and it's so frustrating.
You mentioned planning, and I think this is another key area that we should focus on when it comes to design. We mentioned digital body language earlier, and with engagement, making sure we have these points where we get feedback. How does this work in relation to the planning and design of the actual session?
Great question. And it does lead back to that feedback point and that physical body language that we lose by being live online if you don't have webcams on. When writing a face-to-face session, you might not write into the notes that after you explain a piece of theory, to look around the room, to make eye contact with each student, read their body language, gauge if they've understood. You don't tend to write that in as part of what we do as trainers and facilitators. But live online, you need to design and plan that into the session because it's new as a modality, as a method, as an approach. So you've just talked for 3 minutes on a theory piece of delivery, whatever. You then need to plan into the session a way to get feedback from your attendees. Green tick if, hand up to ask questions, type in chat X. This provides that feedback that firstly, they're still there, you're not teaching to an empty room, but also you can start to gauge their responses.
Yes, I guess that's the point of, if everyone green ticks really quickly, it's like them all nodding and saying, yep, Joe, we're with you, let's move on. And we have sometimes seen someone be really slow with a green tick, and then when you check if they are okay, they unmute and they say, well, actually, I'm thinking because, and all of a sudden, we've picked up, because we've stopped for that feedback, we've then got either, a discussion point or a learning point or a different viewpoint. And, you can actually ask them a question in chat, or you can speak to them on the microphone because you've planned that pause, that engagement, that feedback point in. You've actually planned it into the session.
Absolutely. And if you see them all start typing and see if they understand something about what the point is, you have to plan and design that in. If you don't plan these points in, how will you know the attendees are still there or that they actually understood what you're trying to teach them? If you're not going to engage them, then send them a video or written content or a PDF.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point to make. And also I think about our facilitator guide, and I don't want to go into a crazy amount of detail because we've literally got episode 22, which is entirely dedicated to the facilitator guide that we use to deliver sessions. But, it's basically a form of a script to keep us on track to use for using the platform and for also your sort of session notes all sort of wrapped in one. In short, just give us an idea of how this helps with the design of the session.
Yeah, it's our lesson plan, session notes, it's all our activities, it's all in one document. It helps me quickly go back and see where I've planned interaction, where I have activities. It's visual. If you go to Lightbulbmoment.info, it's a pinned post there and you can go and download it and look at it. And if I have a new activity, I need to teach them the tools, then I need to put that in. If it's the same activity over and over again, I need to think, I need to do this a different way. And of course, you'll have your way of designing and delivering a session already, but that template, it might just give you some ideas or some help. And I know loads of people have said to me they've adapted it or changed it or taken elements into their own work.
Yeah, that's really good. And we always love to hear those people say, oh yeah, I've got your facilitator guide and I've adapted it like this. And it's always really interesting to see how people use it. Okay, so just let me summarise this section on design then.
Actually, Mike, I think an important point we need to go over here is session length and the amount of attendees in our sessions.
Actually, that's probably a really good point to have in the design section. So in which case, continue, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. So many organisations think, okay, I've got a licence for 100 attendees or whatever it might be, so I'll just use that and cram as many people in the session as possible. and that can work. That's a webinar, and a webinar can work. It can be engaging, great. But you must think of these live online sessions like a traditional classroom. Consider the differences as an attendee in a classroom with 9 other people to a kind of classroom or seminar probably with 200 other people. How much individual attention will you receive from the facilitator in that seminar? How many of your questions are actually going to be answered? So when we think about virtual classrooms at Lightbulb Moment, we have a maximum of 10 people. This allows me to tailor to those people to understand their individual learning needs. Now, a lot of you are kind of going, well, that's nice for you, Joe. But under these circumstances around COVID-19, things are different. I'll be honest, I've pushed this to 15, maybe 20 people at points, but then it becomes a large virtual classroom. Those sessions are a little bit more information provision. The learning points are still there, they're still interactive, but it's less tailored, simply because I can't tailor to double the number of people. Above 20, it's much more broadcast like a webinar. None of this is right or wrong. You just have to take into consideration the number of people you have when designing your session, designing your activities, and how you're going to facilitate it.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because I was just going to completely skip all of this. And it's a really essential point when it comes to design, because even just something simple like a whiteboard activity or a question in a chat window completely changes. If you've got 10 attendees, and then if you've got 100 attendees or 200 attendees, it completely changes that activity. You can't get 100 people using the whiteboard. It's going to go crazy. It's going to be just a mess of text. And the same with the chat window. You try and ask a specific point to gauge whether everyone's understood a point, and you've got 100 people typing in the chat. It's going to take you a week to sort of scroll through and go like, oh yes, everyone has understood it. It really impacts the design
and the facilitation. Even in the webinar we ran this morning, I can't remember how many people were there actually.
I think it was 27, 25.
Okay. So that's kind of large virtual classroom bordering on webinar. And because it was a Q&A session, I was answering questions, I couldn't keep up with chat. So I had to ask you, or if you weren't there, I'd have to go back through chat myself, because I just couldn't keep up with it. So the questions you ask, the way you facilitate it will be different depending on the number of people you have. And the session length. If you've got a 30-minute session, you might just use maybe the chat and a few polls. You don't want to necessarily invest the time explaining lots of tools when you might be better off focusing on learning outcomes. And you've got maybe just one core learning point. But in a longer session, you need more activities to mix things up. You need to get other people on the microphone to get different voices involved. If you're a bit more advanced, you might want to use breakouts. You can have a more complex session with multiple learning points. Even at the keeping it simple stage, you can use chat and polls and maybe whiteboards when you get used to it in different ways.
Fantastic. Can I do a summary on the design section? Or have I missed anything out?
I think you can go for it, Mike.
Brilliant. I don't even know where to start on this because it's such a large section. I think, so basically we've had, have the mindset that you can write an engaging session. Don't go in with that defeatist attitude. Focus on the performance and learning outcomes you want to achieve and design your session around that. You can edit and take points from your face-to-face session and make sure to design a live online engagement into it. What would you do face-to-face? Is a whiteboard equivalent to that, for example? Plan those feedback points to get that sort of digital body language equivalents of nodding heads and to actually people to actually ask questions or provide feedback on whether they understand your learning points. And then also, use a few tools, but really understand them and know how they work, because that's going to help you design activities around them, but also to utilize a variety of ways that you use that same tool to keep things different. And then also have a facilitator guide or a session plan, and think about the different amount of attendees you're going to have in your session, the session length. And also one more thing is listen to episode 10 and 11, which is purely about design, because we go into a lot more detail.
Yeah.
We've literally just hit the surface level of this, haven't we?
And actually on Lightbulbmoment.info, we've got a post pinned to the homepage called Virtual Classroom in Numbers, and it expands on that last point about number of people and design and so on.
Brilliant. Okay, let's continue this mammoth podcast and head straight into starting the session well.
The first thing to consider or plan for is that your attendees may have never attended a virtual classroom before. This is important because we can't assume they know how to connect, or what hardware they require, or how to use the tools once they're in a session, or even how a really good virtual classroom session should work.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really valid point. And we always send details to attendees with a list of hardware they need. You know, you need a headset, you need a microphone, a basic idea that they were going to be speaking in the session, that they're going to be using the tools, that it's going to be interactive.
Yeah, there's a minimum you need to send really before the session starts. Obviously, some kind of calendar invite or email letting them know what day and how to connect to the session. Once into the session, this is where you need to make sure they're comfortable and start getting them ready for the session. We always try to be in our sessions half an hour before the session starts, really. And as an attendee, we encourage them to log in maybe 15 minutes before and start using the chat window, start using the microphone.
Yeah, I think this is really important because sort of as they join in, because we are there, we then instantly start engaging them in the chat window or on the microphone, and we let them know that they're in the right place. We let them know that their technology is working, and just giving them faith that when they actually do go to unmute and speak in the microphone, that it's going to work because they've already done it before the session started.
Yeah, or they type in the chat window and we'll respond. It's magic. It starts building a rapport between the facilitator and the attendee. So I get an idea of where in the world or the country they are, where they're attending the session from, what the weather is like. It's simple stuff, but it starts to feel more natural for the attendee. And the added benefit is, as Mike said, I know their microphone's working. The attendee knows how to mute or unmute. I also explain the importance of making sure you mute after speaking, and before the session even starts, people are understanding that point. And just by speaking to them, I'm getting an idea of, are they nervous? Are they up for it? Are they chatty? Are they quiet?
Yeah, no, for sure. But so that's sort of before the session, and I think that's just some good sort of housekeeping to sort of do, you know, as people sort of stick their heads into the virtual classroom, letting them know that they're in a safe place, that they're in the right place. What about as we start going into the session? So maybe the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes, things like that.
So I always explain how to use chat, the emoticons, the hand up icon, muting and unmuting.
And if I can just jump in, so that's not before the session starts. This is that you've designed this into the actual session.
Yeah. So we're starting at, let's say, 10 a.m. and the first thing I've got is a slide saying the session is topic X. I'm Joe. This is Mike. He's your producer. Let's learn the tools. The first tool is emoticons, because that's the quickest, easiest way to say something like, can you hear me? Green tick. It's the quickest, easiest way to respond. Mm-hmm. And then we kind of start layering in these tools. So I teach the green tick and red X, then we use the agenda or the learning outcomes, and just like a really quick green tick if you think that's okay. Then we say, right, here's the chat window, use it for questions, use it for conversation. And then the first thing I do is ask a question, which could be as simple as, what do you want to learn today? What do you want to get from today's session? Or just the opening question of whatever your topic is.
Yeah, and I think going back to sort of what we were saying about the engagement piece earlier on about sort of contrived interactions, you know, because you always sit there and one of the first things you've explained those different emoticons and tools and things like that. And then you say, this is the agenda. give me a green tick if that's what you're looking for. And obviously that's quite a contrived question. And
it's a bit of a leading question, isn't it?
And 99% of the time, everyone just green ticks. And that's kind of what it's there for. It's, yes, you're all still here. You've understood how to use that. You've got engaged. But to be fair, a few times somebody puts a red cross and we actually have a question right away at the start. But it's, what do you think about that sort of contrived nature of that? Why do you do it that way?
I do it that way to make sure people are using it immediately. There's no point me explaining a tool and then not using it for 10 minutes. So here's the tool, green tick, red X. Here's the agenda, we're covering X, Y, Z. Green tick if you're happy. And it's just getting people used to using the tool. It does give them the option to say, actually, are you covering whatever? But as you say, it's just a quick way to say, right, let's move on and keep a certain pace to this as well.
And why is it so important to get people green ticking straight into the chat window or straight onto the microphone if you've got a microphone question at the start?
Because if you spend sort of 10 minutes lecturing right at the beginning, you've lost people. They've turned off, they're in their email, they're on Facebook, they're playing with the cat, and you've got to work really hard to get them back. We've all been to those kind of meetings or sessions where somebody says, I want this to be all about you, and I want this to be about your questions. And then they talk at you for 10 minutes about their history or their background, and you're just bored. So my introduction is literally 30 seconds. This is what I do. Let's get on with it. So by getting that in really early, people are kind of going, oh, it's interactive. They're using the tools immediately, and you are starting as you mean to go on.
Yeah, we often hear from facilitators and they come to us with a question and they say, I ask questions, I try and get engagement in my session and it's just silence, the tumbleweed sort of rolls past and it's an awful, awful feeling. And then when we sort of like probe and ask some questions, say sort of, how do they run their session? And we realise that it's 35 minutes into the session is the first time they say, oh, somebody let me know on the microphone. And if you've gone 35 minutes into a session without having engagement, people have probably gone into that routine of, well, it's just a webinar. And I'm now, people are used to that kind of passive hearing or passive learning or just sitting back from a webinar like that. And it's a complete culture shock to all of a sudden 35 minutes in where you've had no engagement to say, Joe, get on the microphone and let me know. You're going to be flustered. You're not expecting it.
Yeah. Absolutely. You need to set those expectations right from the start. You've not just provided the knowledge, but you've empowered them on how to get involved. You've provided them the opportunity to do so. If you design that from the start, and as you mean to go on and do that every 3 to 5 minutes, it will keep the attendees aware of what's expected of them, and you won't get those tumbleweed moments.
And I guess the attendees quickly get into a routine, don't they?
Yeah, so like we were saying earlier on, we've kind of almost trained people to use green ticks and red X's, trained people to use the chat window. And you said earlier on that sometimes I'll ask questions towards the end of a session or a second or third session, and people are just green ticking or they're just hands up so they can speak. They've got into that routine. They know something's expected of them.
Yeah, and I guess going back to that first point about sort of needing to almost assume the attendee has never been in a virtual classroom before, I guess you need to consider also that they might be quite worried or nervous that something might go wrong or their technology won't work or they're going to do something which just looks silly or stupid.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge leap of faith to make. And when it comes to the materials you send out before the session or the calendar invite, as people log in and the entire session itself, have in your mind, how can you help the attendee be aware of what to do and expect from the session? And it will help the session, it will help them. At the end of the day, we want them to be focusing on the facilitation and the learning, not on the technology. And it's really interesting that often we get attendees at the beginning of sessions when we say, hey Bob, click unmute, please tell us more. And Bob will eventually unmute because it takes a little while to get into that routine, like you say. And then they often say, can you hear me? We say, yes. And then they speak. And then half an hour in or an hour in, they're just unmuting and speaking, and they're not worried about that technology point anymore.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of those things that the attendee will eventually will hopefully get used to the environment, but also we can make it as easy of an environment as possible to start them off with, removing those unknowns of how the session's going to work, the unknowns of the technology, and then actually getting them involved. They practice it, and like you say, should eventually get used to it, and it becomes second nature.
Yeah, I think so. And a lot of that comes down to how you start that session well. That's why it's really important to send out those good materials before the session on what they need to have, like the microphone, the headset, and the basics of how that session will work. In the calendar invite, have details on how to connect to the room, how long the session will be. We always encourage people to log in 10 or 15 minutes early, for instance, and engage people as soon as they join. Let them know they're in the right place and that their technology works, and design the start of the session to explain, to teach, to practice, and then use those live tools that you're going to be using throughout the session.
That's absolutely great advice, and actually I think you've pretty much just done a summary on this section for me, so you've saved me doing that. If we haven't got any more to cover, I don't want you to jump in and all of a sudden say we've missed a whole section. Do you think that covered?
No, I'm good.
Okay, brilliant. And I guess also we've got episode 33, I think it was, which was about starting your sessions. I think it was a guest interview you did, and it was all about sort of starting your sessions well and sending out information and getting them in the right mindset. So that is definitely one to listen to if you've got time to go away with. So let's finish off this mammoth podcast with just some general advice and tips, maybe some stories of what we've done wrong so that people could avoid making those mistakes as well, and just finish off the podcast with that.
No mistakes made here, Mike. Let's move on.
Now, I know that is not true. I know that is definitely not true.
Okay. Well, a major lesson that we've learned is to make sure you double and triple check the hyperlink that you send out to participants.
Yes, we've both made that mistake, and it's been pretty stressful when you're sitting there waiting for your attendees, no one's coming, and then all of a sudden you just start seeing email, can't enter the room, can't get into the room. You then start the session late, and as we said before, we really value chatting with those people before the session, checking the microphone. If all of a sudden nobody gets into your room until 5 minutes into the session, it's just panic stations, isn't it?
Yeah, and it can be hard to slow down when you've had that panic start to the session. We had that when we got Zoom bombed, when we did the e-learning network session, and we managed to restart it. We were, 10 minutes late, and all I kept hearing from you in private chat was, slow down.
Yeah,
that was just like, blah, blah, blah.
That was definitely the adrenaline. Your adrenaline was just sky high.
It was.
But I guess also that's part of the thing about, with always trying to be professional. It's double and triple check that you have muted. And now I've had it a few times because, especially where I'm the producer, more often than not, you're the one who's speaking, and then you might say, "Oh, Mike, what's your point?" or "Mike, come on the microphone." So I'm not muting and unmuting as often as you are, and especially where we jump into different platforms, sometimes I say my piece and I'm like, "Yeah, okay, I'm done," and then I'll start typing in the chat, and then you're typing to me, "Mike, I can hear your keyboard. I've got a really loud, clunky keyboard," and all of a sudden you're like, "Mike, your typewriter's going on," or whatever. So luckily, it's never been anything too bad, but there's the potential for our listeners. There's the potential. Make sure you mute.
Yeah, and it can be really easy to think you've clicked the mute button and you haven't. I've done that more times than I care to remember. So it's just like click here, and then the icons will change. There'll be a different color or whatever, depending on your platform. Just double check you've muted when you think you have. Another one, I joined a webinar recently. I joined the session early because the reminder came up in my calendar, and I thought, right, I'll click. And the host had a screen share set up, but what I could see was the private notes between themselves and their co-host. So, right. I mean, it wasn't too bad, but it didn't look professional. And if you're not ready 10 minutes before the session, I don't know if you've prepared enough. So you also need to make sure that you've maybe locked the room, or you're allowing attendees to enter by clicking, or you have a waiting room option depending upon your software.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You don't want to sort of go in and you've got private note, ask the moron attendees this question. It's like trick them into this to buy in this thing or whatever.
Have you been reading my notes again, Mike?
yeah, exactly. But it's that professional, and it's, I guess, a bit of due diligence and planning before your session. Make sure you've got that set up. And one thing, because you dropped the Zoom bombing in. Yes, we did have a session. We were running a session in someone else's Zoom platform, and we were running a session for them, and it got Zoom bombed. And so I guess one of the things here is you got to check whatever platform you're using. Check the settings, the admin side of it. What can the attendees do? If you're doing a big webinar, do you want so that they can use the annotation tools? Maybe you just need to click no, in this session they can't, but then make sure that when you do your next session, which is a virtual classroom, that you've clicked yes. So it's that kind of like due diligence before the session, isn't it?
Yeah, and some tools like Zoom are really easy to use and really open, but the flip side of that is the security isn't as tight. Now it's getting a lot better. They're making a lot of changes, which is really good. But just go into the back end of your system, i.e. the website, your account, wherever that is for whatever platform you're using, and read up how to use it. Make sure you've got the security and just the plain setup as you want it. People have said to me, oh, well, Zoom's great, but it doesn't have whiteboards. It's like, yeah, it does, but you have to go into your account and flick the switch to turn on whiteboards. So it's just about trying to learn more about your platform.
Yeah, that's a really good point. For often we hear people say, yeah, like, I don't use like Adobe Connect anymore because it doesn't do this. And it's like, yeah, that's like one of the main features. You just haven't turned it on. So, but it's difficult, especially when you're thrown into it now.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I guess it's kind of just do a quick Google search. And I was thinking this actually when we were talking about the design, and you were saying you've got to really know your platform. Or the tools, certain tools. Maybe it's just one of those things that, you're sitting there and you're like, okay, and then you're going to private chat in Zoom. And you just think, actually, I'll just do a quick Google search. Can you do private chat? And as long as you know it's there, then you can put it into the design. But I've gone off track here.
Well, one last point on that is most of the platforms have got really good support features. Zoom's are really good, really clear. Adobe Connect, for instance, has got a great YouTube channel with loads of videos on there for learning how to do things. So definitely go and use those help systems. They're really good.
And you've also got our community as well, Lightbulbmoment.community, that you can always ask questions on.
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, everybody knows about that already, Mike. That's why,
of course,
goes without saying.
So getting back onto this stories and things that we hear, one thing that I often see on webinars, or like I say, when we do our training courses and people get that chance to practice that facilitation, they often go into sort of narrative explaining what they're doing. So I'm going to click the next slide now, everyone. Or now I'm clicking to load the poll, everyone. Or I'm clicking off the screen from my notes. It's why do people do that?
I think it's partly that worry about the silence. And also it's calming. It's a control response. And you're right, we often see it on the courses when people get a chance to do that practice sort of teach back delivery. It's about being aware if you start doing it and realising that you're maybe using the production team, like in the theatre. You don't have the actors say, I'm going to raise the curtain now. I'm going to wheel the props in now. Yeah. A certain level of it is good, especially if something's going wrong, to be able to say, something's gone wrong. I'm just trying to work out what to do. But you don't need to say, on the next slide, because it's like, well, the next slide's coming up. You just click it. It's about making that more fluid. And that takes a bit of practice and experience.
Yeah, great points. But I also wonder, it's kind of almost using a bit of a showmanship, isn't it? Of, distraction. Look over here whilst you don't see I'm loading the poll or whatever. But I wonder if some of this goes into what maybe we should have mentioned it in the design of actually putting it into the design of your session, into that facilitator guide of, if it's a bit clunky for you to load a poll, to sit there and say, okay, guys, just drop in the chat window. What were your thoughts on the previous topic we were talking about whilst you load the poll? So maybe it's not that whole, like, you don't have to be a magician and distract whilst you go down the secret hatch or whatever it is, but it's just using that bit of trickery maybe, And I would think face to face, probably you would do something similar. It's like you're moving on. I've got to get the flip chart. Okay, all of you discuss amongst yourselves X.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you know when you're running face to face that you've got 2 or 3 minutes to set up an activity or whatever, you wouldn't necessarily want to be looking awkward in front of people. So you might just say, okay, speak to the person next to you about whatever. So I think you make a great point, and it reduces the tension on you. I always remember doing a face-to-face presentation years and years ago, probably the biggest one I'd done at the time, like to 300 people. I was bricking it. I was so nervous. And the very first thing I did when I went out, I was like, hi, I'm Joe, I'm talking about X. Talk to the person next to you. What do you know about whatever it was I was talking about? And that just immediately got the attention off of me to somewhere else. So it's doing a version of that. It's saying, type in the chat a word about how you're feeling right now about the topic. And then you go click, click, click. Then you go back to the chat and you've got your poll ready.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the points that often, whether it's a webinar or a training course, we say to the people, are you worried about the remote nature of this, the fact that you can't see your attendees? And 9 times out of 10, we get green ticks, yes, like I'm not going to be able to see the body language. Every now and then we get a red cross, and often that person says, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm not going to be seen. I can have my drink. I can be in my pajamas. I can check my notes, whatever it is, yeah? And all of a sudden, that then becomes quite a valid point that everyone else sits and goes, actually, yeah, I'm not going to be the one front and center the whole time. I've got a bit more time. And like you say with that face-to-face session, you can give yourself that bit of time where you can just go, right, okay, I can relax for a second. I have a sip of my tea, look at my notes for the next point. I can embrace that bit of silence and let people think. So I think that is some really good advice. What about going back onto stories where we've been terrible?
Yeah, because everybody always really likes those. Another good point is trying to make sure you use people's names and pronounce them correctly. I once went through an entire session, and each time I saw a person type in chat, I said their name completely wrong. And it was actually near the end of the session, I got them on microphone, and the first thing they said was how to pronounce their name. So that was a bit silly.
Oh, yeah, actually, it was. I laugh about it now, but it felt pretty bad at the time because we literally got like right near the end of the session, and you were like, "Oh, blah blah blah," get on the microphone, and they literally just came on the microphone and said, "Well, first thing, Joe, my name is actually Bliss," and it was just like.
Yeah.
Oh,
and the worst part was I had complete confidence saying their name because I knew somebody else with the same name had that pronunciation. But it turned out I was pronouncing their name wrong too, and they never told me.
Yeah, exactly. But so this is why I always see that you know, especially if it's let's say the slightly more exotic spelling of a name. You often say, "Oh, I've just read your comment out in chat. Just please let me know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly," because it's, you know, it's a personal thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Is it? I'm going to butcher a saying now. Dale Carnegie said something like, "To a person, their name is the sweetest sound in the world." And basically, it's just like our names are really important to us. It's a really small thing, but it could just change the session. It could change what people take away and just their mindset of the fact that you've spent a moment just saying, please tell me how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I want to mention, especially where at the moment we keep on jumping from Zoom to WebEx to Adobe Connect, we're training in different platforms, and that's the fact that the chat function works differently. So we've done a lot in Zoom recently where loads of people have been jumping into Zoom. They want to be trained in Zoom. And when somebody private messages you in Zoom, it automatically changes your response when you go to type to private message back to them. It's kind of a handy thing of this is what's happened. Yeah. But then you go into WebEx and it doesn't do that. So all of a sudden I've got used to somebody private chats me a question or whatever, and I say, oh, blah, 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 here you go. And in Zoom, they get the message back. And I jump into WebEx and all of a sudden I'm typing to everyone, well, the problem is your microphone is rubbish or whatever it is. You know,
yeah, we know Joe's chatting on and on and on, but she'll get to the point eventually.
Exactly. So it kind of goes back to that, you know, know how that chat works and the nuances of it, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, I should have said, with lots of chat windows, make sure it's set to send to the correct people. So some platforms, it can send to particular groups like panelists or hosts or whatever. And it means you as a facilitator can actually miss what's going on. I was in a WebEx session and I thought I had a really quiet group with only a few people typing. And what I found out was that actually many of the attendees had changed who they were sending messages to. And it was actually only each other and not me as a host. So then they probably thought I was ignoring them.
Yeah, you really don't want to get halfway through a session and the attendees have switched off because they're like, well, she's not going to answer my questions.
Yeah.
But it's just the fact that you can't physically see them. They're not actually there. And this is why it goes back to, I know you mentioned it briefly and we said about, I think it was the hardware episode 12, why you have another laptop or another device logged into the session, because often I think it's the main culprit WebEx, but I think Zoom might be one as well, where you can make it so you're typing to the attendees but not the host. So if you have a laptop logged in, if all of a sudden you see loads of messages coming up on a laptop but they're not coming up on your actual main machine, or say you're seeing them on your tablet, that can give you an indication of okay, you need to change this.
Yeah, exactly that. So that's why, even if it's your old laptop or, as you say, a mobile phone, it can just really help with that.
Mm-hmm. What about some other sort of quick fire stories that we can go through to finish this off with?
Well, screen share can be an amazing tool, but like any technology, if you don't use it wisely, it can be very bad. On a webinar recently, I asked people if they'd had some embarrassing stories about screen sharing gone wrong, and there were a few about email notifications popping up about people who were actually on the session with them.
Oh, that is brutal. I can just imagine sort of like, Jane needs to be fired or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden it just pops up at the bottom right of your screen, subject, title, fire Jane, whatever it is. Bob is a moron. It's just like, that is... How do you avoid this though? Okay,
well, many platforms you can choose to screen share a single application like Word or PowerPoint or whatever. This makes it so you don't need to worry about what's on your desktop or getting a sensitive email coming through or anything like that. We often hear about people complaining about floating boxes that cover the screen. That's usually WebEx. That's chat and participants panel. So the facilitators opened them on their screen to make sure they can still interact, which is brilliant. But we don't want this to be blocked for attendees. So if you have a second screen, it's putting those there. Or if you had maybe a laptop or a tablet, you don't need to turn them on because you can look at your laptop or your tablet and use the hands up there, or you can use the chat there if you want to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just to summarise that, in WebEx, you do a screen share, it shares your screen. But if you have the chat and participants panel, open, it blocks that off because it doesn't want you to share that.
It's like a security thing, really.
Yeah, exactly. But if you have those panels over the top of parts of your presentation, people then can't see it. So it's about moving them to a separate screen or minimising them. One thing I thought I did want to mention about Zoom, we should have had this in the platform section. Zoom can be really fiddly if you've got it full screen or if you've got it maximised and with the chat panels. That's something to have a play around with. I think it's Alt F or Control F, which basically makes it full screen. So if you make it full screen, the chat panel and the participants panel will become like floating boxes that you can move around. But if you maximize it like your a Windows folder and you would maximize it to go full screen, you can do that in Zoom and it kind of locks the chat panel to the right hand side. It's just a little nuanced, annoying thing, but it's something to be aware of. If you all of a sudden you've got people saying, I've lost the chat or I can't find this, it could be that in Zoom.
Or as a facilitator, you're saying, click in the chat box on the left. It's like, well, you might have it on the left, but actually it usually docks or kind of fixes to the right. And this is where, again, knowing your platform is important. So something like WebEx or Adobe Connect, it's set for you. You've got much more control over that, whereas with Zoom, the participants have the control. So just knowing your platform and not saying the wrong thing if possible.
Yeah, I think think that is absolutely great advice. And I'm aware that this has been a mammoth podcast.
Oh, yes.
We have thrown a whole load of information in there, loads of different episodes to get more details on. We've also got our community, which is Lightbulbmoment.community. That is absolutely free. You can ask questions on there. Also, we've got resources. If you go to the top right, there's a resources section where you can find all of our other podcasts and webinars and things like that. Any final points from you, Joe?
I just think we need to do a whole podcast of laughing through our embarrassing stories.
Yeah, we do have a podcast about I'm sure we have a podcast. I should have saved it where we go through stories like that. But anyway, that could be.
I'm sure we've got more to update.
Exactly, that could be for our listeners to find. But it's one of those things. If you are starting this journey now, or you've delivered a few sessions, we really hope this podcast has helped you, and we really hope that everyone listening stays safe and that things start to improve in the coming weeks.
Yeah. Good luck, everybody.